Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first live online learning event from the World Association for Person-Centered and Experiential Psychotherapy and Counselling. And of course, it's with David Murphy. Very warm welcome to you, David.
Thank you, John.
It's great to have you as the first person in the programme, so it's an exciting start.
Yes, thank you. Let's hope so.
Yeah, I'm not putting you under too much pressure there. And of course, a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us live online. It's great to have you here from the WAPSET members from around the world. So thank you for joining us. The chat room is on, and if anyone wants to just log in there, both David and I can see the comments, the questions, and we're hoping to have a bit of an interactive experience today. So David, to get us started, maybe I could just ask you where you're located. Give us a sense of your geography. Would that be okay?
That's fine. Yeah. So I'm currently in the University of Nottingham in the UK, which for those that don't know, the UK is pretty much smack bang in the centre of England. And I work here in the School of Education at the university, where we run a number of counselling programs, and we have a centre specialising in trauma studies. So I'm sort of based pretty much full time in the University of Nottingham.
Yeah, thank you, David. That gives us a sense of where you are, and of course, made famous by the stories of Robin Hood, I guess, that area of the UK.
Indeed, or Brian Clough.
Or Brian Clough. Well, absolutely. Yes, depends which folklore you enjoy the most. Before we get into the interview, maybe I could ask you to say a little bit about your kind of journey to here, a little bit about your professional experience.
Sure. Okay. Well, I have been here actually at University of Nottingham since 1999 when I came as a trainee, and studied on the programs here. First completing a diploma in person-centered counselling and then a master's degree. And a year later, I came back and did some work with one of the groups, and then the year after that, I sort of joined as a part-time tutor. So since the sort of mid 2000s, I've been here at the university as a university tutor first, and now I'm full time since 2008. At which point I came and worked at the university in the Centre for Trauma, Resilience and Growth, which has been a partnership between University of Nottingham and Nottinghamshire Healthcare NHS Trust, where we've provided training and therapy based around the person-centered approach. I continue to hold a honorary position within the Mental Health Trust as a psychologist, and having just recently finished in the providing psychotherapy there in the trauma centre. I'm concentrating now fully on the university here and developing a new programme actually, which is due to be launched next October, a new Masters in Person-Centered Experiential Counselling Psychotherapy. So I've worked in the mental health settings. I've also worked in occupational health and in a university counselling centre too.
Yeah, so it sounds like a really interesting journey you've had to here. And I guess once the university got a hold of you in 1999, they weren't going to let go then. They were going to make sure that you...
Or the other way around.
You were going to stay with them, yes. And it sounds like a real hotbed for person-centered and experiential therapies. A lot going on and developments. And
yeah, we're a sort of diverse team in terms of our interests. And here at Nottingham, the first sort of provision of humanistic and experiential approaches into the School of Education was in 1968, when Dr. Eric Hall opened up the sort of pathway. And since then, there's been a constant presence through an MA in Human Relations, first a certificate in counselling and education, and then a master's in counselling, and then a master's in children and young people. So for over 40 years, we've been providing training to professionals and to counsellors in humanistic, person-centred, experiential approaches. So there's a long tradition of it here in Nottingham, and specifically in the university. In fact, I was doing some research recently and found out that Rogers came to the University of Nottingham and conducted a week-long encounter group with over 100 people present. And I have some photos of him sitting on the lawns at the back of Derby halls of residence on the main university campus with John K. Wood, Natalie Rogers, Maureen O'Hara, Cara Rogers. We were lucky enough to have Maureen here giving a talk last year, and her partner Bob managed to find some pictures from that event. And so there's a long history and connection with the approach.
Wow, a distinguished history, and amazing events in the history too. Encounter groups of over 100 people.
Yeah, and I think that it's an important part of our development currently going forward. Certainly, is to really remember and acknowledge the work of everybody that's been here over the years. Some really influential people. Certainly, in terms of my development and sort of professional development. Having been a student here, developing both personally and professionally, I think is it's a big part of what we do. And so there's people on the corridor which had a big influence on me, and I think this kind of thing carries on. It's like it's a sort of community learning environment.
Yes, sounds like a lovely environment to grow in then. And of course, you're also contributing to the continuation of that environment in terms of the writing that you're doing. And the event today is the theme for today is the mutuality of Rogers' therapeutic conditions, the process and outcome of successful psychotherapy, which is based around a recent journal article in the WAPSEP journal. Where you really are bringing together, based on Rogers' original hypothesis, some new ideas and some new possibilities for research. But maybe I could ask you, maybe this is a bit of an obvious question, but what got you thinking about these kind of things? I mean, it sounds like you're steeped in that environment there at Nottingham, but what was the driver for you?
Well, I mean, this sort of a research project the paper is basically based on my doctoral research that I started in 2005 or 6, I think, and I think one of the things that really got me to think about this idea of mutuality was my experience of both training and also of being in personal therapy as a client. And I think from the research that I'd read and looked at in relation to person-centered therapy and the therapeutic relationship, it had concentrated quite a lot on the therapist's contribution to the therapeutic relationship. And I was quite interested in the client's contribution to the therapeutic relationship, and trying to get an understanding of how, you know, both the client and the therapist are able to create a space, a a climate in which people can change and can grow. And I thought, that, you know, there's at least two people in that relationship, and only one of them's really being researched as far as we understand the conditions. I think.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, and I think that, you know, there are other ways in which we can understand what the client does in therapy, but I'd say they're usually presented in diagnoses, or you know, they're sort of ways of categorizing clients so that, you know, they behave like this in therapy because of this, and I wasn't really interested in doing that, so I had to find another way to think about, well, how do clients and therapists work together in the relationship. And I started reading and going over things and trying to think of what was my experience, what am I reading, what am I seeing, and yeah, so it was just immersing myself in the literature around the therapeutic relationship that got me to thinking about this idea of mutuality. And I think the first thing that really twigged it for me was reading the dialogue between Rogers and Buber, and or actually reading a book about the dialogue between Rogers and Buber. Okay. And in that book there was a version of the transcript which was different to the other book that I had, with a version of the transcript in it, and I found that quite interesting, and their analysis of the dialogue, and that got me really thinking then about, well, maybe there's more to this idea of mutuality than I'd first understood, and it was perhaps for me maybe dismissed from our you know, thoughts a bit too quickly.
Yeah, so the idea that the therapist creates an environment, and within the environment the client flourishes. In terms of what you've been reading and researching, that's only half the story, really, that the client has a massive impact on that, also on the environment and the conditions of the environment. And I noticed in your article you really draw attention to some of the things that Rogers said that implicitly refers to that in his conversations with Buber. And
yeah, I mean, I think, and the more I read it, I don't know whether I'm just seeing it, okay. But the more I read, the more I see it. Whether that's just because we find what we go looking for, I don't know. But you know, the more I'm reading, the less I'm seeing it as implicit, and the more I'm seeing statements to the effect that you know, this was possibly becoming explicit in the theory. Yeah, at certain points I really do think it's quite explicit. So yeah, maybe we'll talk about those soon.
Yes, okay, well, that sounds good. Yeah, I suppose I'm thinking about some of those original research paradigms where trying to really get a hold of what the therapist was doing that was making a difference, and so the research paradigm is very much focused on the therapist, and maybe that creates an emphasis of what the therapist is doing to the client. But in your article, you're really drawing attention to something that's cyclical, like the impact of the client is coming back to the therapist. And
yeah, I think that Yeah, that's certainly not where I started, but that's where I got to. I think that there's something about we're in there. I think when we practice client-centered therapy, when we're in therapy as clients, this as therapists, this is what we do. This is what we experience, and so we experience the conditions: unconditional, positive regard, and an empathic understanding for the client, um, and we communicate that to the client, congruently. And so, whilst it's something that as a therapist we experience, I think we see a shift in the way of conceptualizing the relationship from being one where this is something that the therapist experiences, but also this is something that we saw Rogers say was then communicated to the client, but then it was perceived by the client, and then also where he suggests that it's not enough to perceive, but also the client has to receive. And to me, that's a series of shifts in the way in which we're conceptualizing the relationship from, as you're describing, John, something that's done to the other person to something that we're in with the other person. So yeah, I mean, I think that's what I am suggesting is there. I don't think that's anything groundbreaking. So my attention then turned to, well, what's happening for the client to be able to receive the conditions experienced by the therapist for the client. So then I started to think about and read around. Well, what does the client need? What are the resources and the capacities that the client might need to be able to receive the therapist's unconditional positive regard and empathic understanding?
Yeah, what are the shifts that might be going on that might then we might describe as outcomes, I guess, of therapy?
Well, exactly, and I think that's where in the title for this talk is there's very little, as Rogers sort of suggests, that differentiates process from outcome. So things that are listed as process within therapy could equally be listed as outcomes, and vice versa. And again, we're back to this cyclical, relational process of experiencing one another in the relationship.
Yeah, in that cycle, I guess. And we've just had a comment in the chat room asking whether these ideas, as you were reading and writing and researching, was that informing your practice? Was it changing what you were doing? I can see you smiling at the question.
Well, that's an interesting question. Who's asked that question? I'll tell you why I'm asking, because at the moment I'm writing a book chapter, and one of the things that the point at which it's been written and it's finished as a draft, and now it's being revised, and one of the reviewer has asked for an explanation of how the research informs practice in client-centered therapy. So I'm smiling because I'm questioning about whether or not it does.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that catches the next bit of the question, which I think you address a little bit in the article, that like, has it changed your way of being within client to encourage mutuality? So I suppose there's.
No.
Mm,
I think what I think happens when I'm talking about mutual experiencing of Rogers' therapeutic conditions. Um, there's a couple of things that I'm not saying, and that is that it's something that's desirable, because I don't think you need to desire it, because I think it's going to happen anyway. And this is where I was talking about the what does the client do to receive the therapist's experience of unconditional positive regard and their empathic understanding of the client. Well, as far as I see, part of the process of perception in a relationship involves empathy. So for me to perceive you right now in this interview, John, I need to have some empathic awareness of you. You know, my responses to your questions about who's going to speak next, about is it my turn, your turn, you know, do you want me to say a bit more about this? Shall I wait? Have you got a question ready? You know, so there's what's so I think that that what's happening there is I am perceiving, you know, you in one way, but I'm also receiving you, because I'm taking that information in, and I'm doing something with it. Partly that is I'm making some judgments, decisions, interpretations about what's going on, and part of that is based on my experience of you and in this moment. Now, I think that's what's happening in interpersonal situations all the time. And so just taking empathy alone, I don't think I need to do anything specifically different for that to start a process in the client, because I think they're doing it anyway. I think what happens when they're exposed to an environment which is empathic is they respond in a way which is reciprocal. So when they experience being empathized with, they develop greater self-understanding and empathy, and that is also then manifest in their interpersonal relations with others. And I think we can understand that as far as if we look at early infant or child development, where very early on infants are evidencing their ability to be able to read the other person, the caregiver, and that's where they're learning, and they're having that capacity for shared experience and a sort of a shared awareness of what's happening and in their experiencing. And I see a similar process going on in other interpersonal relations, and I'm saying that I think that's what Rogers described was happening in the therapeutic relationship. And I think so exactly the same as what I've just said there could also be applied to unconditional positive regard. It's a reciprocal process, and as one experiences it for someone else, and experience it for yourself, you experience it for someone else, and you experience it for yourself, and Rogers described this as a psychological chain reaction that's set in motion. And so I don't think I was starting to do anything differently to try to make a relationship more mutual, because I would see that as being the natural consequence of being in an accepting and understanding relationship with someone.
Yeah, that sounds like a really important point to catch about what you're describing here, David. Because it's easy when we start to get a hold of some of the things that are happening in the relationship to translate that as, oh, well, how can we influence that more? But actually, it's an observation as opposed to an admonition to do something. Or,
I think my sort of motivation for doing this is trying to understand what's happening rather than making something happen, something specific happen. It's about really trying to understand more about what's going on between the client and the therapist, and understand more about how therapy works, because it works. And I think that's been my motivation for doing this.
And it sounds like what you're saying in that reciprocal action, as it kind of goes round the cycle, I experience you, you experience me, both of our capacities for empathy and valuing each other expand. And that's what the client comes away with, that these kind of natural capacities that the client has become greater or more expanded, more accessible to the client.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way I'd understand it is that they are they're the psychological processes required for if you like, mechanisms for processing experience. So the more unconditional self-regard, positive self-regard that I experience, the more I'm able to experience congruently, represent my experience in awareness congruently, and the more I'm able to experience unconditional regard for someone else. I think that there's less need for distortion and denial, and one guesses that that's the same process for the client, that as they're more able to experience or bring to therapy those experiences which are difficult or distressing, that they're then feeling that they're received. So the therapist receives the client, and so on and so forth. So we go around in this cycle. So if those processes become, however we describe it, whether it's they're expanded or whether they're enhanced or whether they're more at the disposal of the client, I don't know how to describe it really, but yeah, I think they then become both the process and the outcome of the therapy.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think there's something quite grounding or even humbling for me as a therapist, that it's not just me doing to the client. I'm walking away different as well. That there's whatever it is that's shifting, there's something shifting in me too, with my ability or less need to distort my experience, and more able to be congruent to what's happening for me. And yeah, I think there's a kind of equalizing in that, which I guess again is that word mutuality.
Well, I think the idea of things being equal is a interesting one in this field, and because I guess the partly the reason why the therapist is the therapist is because, and the client is the client in the therapy, means that there is an inequity, and that I think inequity comes in lots of different forms. So I'm not saying that when I'm referring to mutuality that I think it's the same as saying that everything's equal. And I think maybe that's where the previous on previous occasions, the discussion around mutuality in the literature, in relation to Buber's dialogue with Rogers and Friedman's work about this, and also somebody called Lewis Aaron from the relational psychoanalysis school. They've talked a lot about the idea of mutuality and equity, and there's a difference between things being mutual and things being equal, which I think is an important issue here. So it's about being able to recognize what's not equal but can be mutual.
Yeah, you really draw attention to that in the article, where the both minds and both attentions of the therapist and the client are on the client's experience.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, I think there's an interesting bit. I can't remember if I referenced it in that paper, but interesting bit of work done by Ronnie Lang some time ago. He wrote a book called Interpersonal Perception, and in there, I think the full reference is Lang, Phillipson, and Lee, and they talk about this idea of your awareness, of my awareness, of your awareness, of my awareness, and it's an ad infinitum experience of kind of who's in the frame, so to speak, or who's being held in awareness. And I think that the clients in their receiving the therapist's conditions are also partly receiving a part projection of themselves, and so I think that's how they're getting themselves back in part. So their hearing of your experience of their experience is also partly a projection as well, and I think vice versa.
Yes, yeah, I think that's really interesting in terms of the projection. I notice I have a kind of question I was interested to ask you, but there are also a couple of things happening in the chat room. So let's do that first, and then maybe I'll get to squeeze mine in before before the hour's up. There's a research question in there, whether mutuality is measurable. I wondered if you had any thoughts about that, David.
Well, I think the answer to that question is it depends what you think mutuality is. So there is the way I've talked about it in the paper is that if we're talking about the mutual experiencing of therapeutic conditions, well, I mean, if you think that the research on a therapeutic relationship, if you think that's valid, so Goff Barrett Leonard's relationship inventory, let's take that as one way of measuring the therapeutic conditions. So in that in using that measure, the client fills out their response in terms of how well they felt received by the therapist by answering questions in relation to positive regard, unconditionality of regard, congruence, and empathy. So if you think all of the research that most of us in the person-centered approach like to use to support us in relation to the impact of the therapeutic relationship on outcome, if you think that's valid, then the answer is yes, we can measure the mutual experiencing of the therapeutic conditions, because you just ask both halves of the therapeutic dyad to complete a Barrett-Leonard relationship inventory. So that's what I did in the research. So the paper that hasn't yet been published but is currently awaiting publication in psychotherapy research is an empirical study where that's it. That's exactly what I did with 60 odd therapy dyads. I asked them both to complete a shortened version of Barrett-Leonard's relationship inventory in regards to their experience of the other person in the relationship. And that was what I used as a proxy for mutuality. So the answer to the question is, do I think that it's possible to measure mutuality? If mutuality is going to be defined in the way that I've presented it, so for me, that's how I've presented it, as a mutuality of therapeutic conditions, and the answer is yes in that respect. But other people might think that, you know, mutuality means something different. And you know, but that's for them to define and decide whether they can measure it in that respect. But I'm talking about it in relation specifically to Rogers' therapeutic conditions.
Yeah. So you asked those 60 dads about both sides how much they felt received, I guess, by the other, and that the correlation between those two experiences would create a sense of mutuality. Yeah.
So, you know, usually one expects there to be a correlation between, you know, the client's rating of the therapist as, you know, empathic and accepting and genuine, and there's usually a correlation between that and the outcome of the therapy. So, what I did in the research was ask both people in the relationship to rate how they felt towards the other person and how they felt the other person received them. And that was so both for the client and the therapist. And it was possible to look at then the what it's actually termed a sort of moderation analysis. So you look at the relationship between the client's rating of the therapist and the outcome of therapy. So the correlation between, or the relationship between those two variables in the presence of a third variable. And the third variable was the therapist's experience of the client. And what the data suggested was that that relationship between the client's experience of the therapy and the successfulness of the outcome of therapy was much stronger when therapists also experienced the client as being receptive, rather than when therapists rated the client as being low in receiving them in the relationship. So from that, we were able to deduce that when there's a mutual experience of the therapeutic conditions, the outcome of the therapy is more successful.
That's fascinating. That where the client has been more able to receive, or the therapist experiences it that way anyway, that the outcomes are better.
Yeah, and those results were maintained when we controlled for the level of distress the person was in when they first attended therapy, and also the rating of the other person over time, because we did this over 3 sessions. So this is the other thing. So this is only in the first 3 sessions we were able to show this. So over a longer period of time, one imagines that those processes become outcomes increasingly so. So if we would imagine that the effect would become stronger over time. But we don't know that, but I would.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense of your description that as the client is more able to process, then the outcomes are stronger. It's one and the same thing, really.
Mm.
And well, I get to slip my question in because I guess
Okay.
I'm the one sitting opposite you. And one of the things that we've been interested in at Temenos is that therapists' ability to think about how well the client is able to receive the therapist, to have a sense of how that's going for the client, that it's not just a broadcast of conditions, but
Mm.
to that's also part of the empathy, I guess, to know
Mm.
whether the client is being impacted is part
Mm.
of that cycle, and that being part of a therapist's competence actually. And I wondered if that was something that you'd thought about, that the therapist might think about the things that are maybe blocking the client from experiencing the
Mm.
therapist. Or
Mm.
I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. No, it does make sense. I mean, I guess for me that's something which is inherent within the empathic response, is also a sense of how it will be received. Um, so I think I read an example somewhere. I can't remember who wrote this, but you know, it was something along the lines of a client experiencing um, um, a fairly high degree of shame, and a therapist uh, sensing this, and sensing how ashamed of their shame this client was, and believing that in their responses as empathic, because they had a sense of it, that they let the client know that they can see how ashamed they feel, and actually how misattuned that could be as a response. So I would see this as being inherent within an empathic response. That is, it has an element to it which is an awareness of how one's being received. I think another part of what you said, which made me think of something, John, which is about the impact on the other person, because I think part of this research has got me thinking about um, how clients are able to impact the therapist, and if part of being uh, a sort of a fully functioning um, person, part of being in the relationship with the client is about experiencing the other person. Okay, so having a sense of the other person. The client needs to know that they're having an impact on the therapist. So the question comes about how do you let the client know, I think, that they've had an impact on you, without well, yeah, I don't know. It's just an open question. How do we let the client know that they're having an impact? How does the client know they're having an impact? And this I think is where it becomes really interesting in terms of responding from the client's frame of reference, and where therapist frame responses might appear. And I think this is probably a fairly contentious area in terms of what then manifests in the therapeutic relationship. So I think it's not. I don't have any answers to that specifically, but I think it's a very interesting area that we're starting to get into, about how do we let the client know that they have an impact, that they have agency, that they're able to affect another person.
Yeah. Well, the question in the chat room here: are we talking about something to do with congruence here, which I guess we how much as a therapist can we say, or is it helpful to say, or
Mm,
like an example that you gave about shame, just to kind of that straight back at you for the
mm,
client. I can
mm,
see exactly this. Is it helpful or is it no? Or yeah.
mm, mm. Well, yeah. I mean, I think maybe there's different. Well, there are different ways of being empathic, and um, yeah. I mean, I think I want to just qualify something for my own sake here in relation to congruence about to me um, that that being uh, a an experience for me as the therapist, how I'm symbolizing my experience in awareness. So I'm I think fairly sort of conservative about that in relation to my take on it. I suppose what I'm thinking here is that for me, congruence is not the thing about what do I decide to say to the client in the name of congruence,
Mm.
right? So so it's like I'm being congruent, so I can say blah blah blah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think uh, that my responses to the client are, um, I think they're nearly, I'm going to say nearly always based on empathic responses or an empathic responsivity, and that I make my responses under the umbrella of empathy rather than making a response under the umbrella of congruence, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, it really does, and yeah, it feels like a really beautiful description of the. It's still in the service of the client as you respond. You're thinking about how they are. What will it be like to receive your response, your experience of them? It's not just ticking a box. I'm now being congruent. I'm doing that bit of
Mm,
therapy or whatever.
mm, mm. And I do think that there's been some uh, discussion around whether people start to use congruence as a justification for being in the relationship in a way that makes it more mutual, if you like. And that's not how I under, understand it in terms of if it's what's going to drive my responses to the client, because what drives my response to the client is an experience of unconditional positive regard and my empathic understanding of them as I experience that in the relationship. And so I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it might be my misunderstanding of congruence in that regard, because I know that other people do take it the element of transparency and and of uh, you know saying what they've got to say, and I'm not sure I have really positioned myself as a therapist or as a researcher in looking at mutuality in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know if that. I mean, I guess we probably are. It's in response to the question. We probably are talking about congruence. However, I'm also thinking that that's for me about, yeah, there might be a mutual congruence, but that's because there's a mutual accurate symbolizing of experience in awareness um, that isn't necessarily then a justification to say what has been accurately symbolized in awareness, be it a thought or or a response to the client, because there is this like we've just, I think, qualified it with, or just clarified it with, this service to being empathic and unconditionally accepting. That I think they're the means by which I would make a response.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking about that moment where two people are having an accurate symbolizing of an experience, and it's very similar, and it might not be communicated verbally. There might, it might be experienced together. But
yeah, I mean, I think when we do experience those kinds of moments, perhaps in the therapeutic relationship, that they are embodied in the sense that there's a physiological kind of shift. Whether it be I think that's it. There's a physiological dimension to those moments of congruence, and therefore there might not be a need to communicate something verbally. We're doing some research here at the moment with another researcher from Vienna, Peter Slovak, who is doing some research on the synchronicity in physiological responses between a client and a therapist during a session. So we're collecting data, physiological data on the client and the therapist. They're analog sessions, so they're not real therapy sessions, but they're two people, one in the role of client, one in the role of therapist, and we're collecting data to look at the synchrony in terms of their physiological responses to one another when engaged in an empathic, accepting encounter. Now, we don't have data for that yet, but there are other studies that have been carried out to look at the physiological synchronicity in terms of affective response between two people, and it suggests that there is a synchronicity, and I reckon we probably do sense that in the therapy room too, when we're very much in tune with the other person and we're accurately representing experience in our awareness, that both people are engaged in that. There's a synchronicity.
Yeah, that sounds like a really fascinating study.
We're calling it the Frankenstein study because there's wires everywhere.
Right. So it really is physiological processes that you're measuring, yeah. But also, I'm really glad you said earlier about noticing the projection that's going on. And that feels really important in as a therapist, staying vigilant to what is being shared and what might the client be experiencing that's coming from their experience. That is a projection. So I need to just kind of stay alive to that we might be sharing something and there's going to be a difference to that, or there could be a difference coming from the projection from me as a therapist or as a client. That sounds really important to help me to stay alive to that as well.
Yeah, I think, I guess it's as much as we are as therapists trying to experience what it is like for the other person in our I think processing of that experience, where we're kind of running it through our own I don't know, whatever system, and there is something about it picking up, I guess it picks up traces and it gets given back. No, I don't think that means it's those, that's an unhelpful thing. I think it's just an inevitable thing.
Yeah.
that it's it might actually be a helpful thing. It might be me. I get a sense of John in your reflections of me, in here. Do you see what I mean? It's like, and that might be actually just what I need. It's like to help me keep talking or keep exploring something. So uh, that it's happening doesn't necessarily, I think, make it unhelpful. I guess if it's
Yeah. Well, there's the suggestion of another word that might be useful: imagination. And I think even then being able to make contact with each other's imagination and can fuel that cycle even further, I guess, to know each other better as we experience more of each other's minds.
I think I mean, I guess I can see how, having that other person in your mind and thinking about them, and your imagination of their imagination would be good. But there's one thing I wanted to say about the, if we're offbeat or off track, I think that was the other thing we haven't talked about is, well, what about when there are those misattunements? And one of the things that I noticed in Rogers's 59 paper was a footnote, which really had an impact on me, and often wondered, what it means symbolically that it's just a footnote. But in one of the sections within that chapter, he talks about the characteristics of a deteriorating relationship. And he's extrapolating from therapy, but in a deteriorating relationship, one of the things that helps correct the relationship is where he talks about person X or person Y or whatever. But if we talked about a client and a therapist, so if we took it back into therapy, if you're off beam with your empathy, or you're out of tune, you're not really getting the point, the client's response to that can be quite important. So in that footnote, he stated that the thing that corrects the relationship at that point is the other person's unconditional positive regard. So one of the things I think that we can explore further is this idea that clients have potential to get the relationship back on track, and that as therapists we can be off beam from time to time, and that it's our job not to be, but at time to time we might be, and that actually clients are pretty good at getting us back on track, and they can, they too can offer something into the relationship that enables it to work effectively. But it's not just all about what therapists do.
Like the client might save the relationship too, or might recover us from something in a really helpful way.
Exactly. I mean, it's, there's something in the relationship as a whole which has, a lot of there's a lot of resource within the relationship that isn't solely dependent on the therapist. I think Art Bohart's been telling us for quite some time.
I was just thinking about Art Bohart as you were saying that, and noticing that our hour has come and gone already. It's just gone in a flash, really. And David, thank you for just a really thoughtful and very stimulating hour together about that fascinating topic of mutuality. It feels like something that needs much more exploration, I'm sure will, in the research in the years to come, and that you've given us a great place to start from, and a great place to start the WAPSEP live online events from too. So thank you, David.
Well, it's been a pleasure, John. Thank you very much indeed.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks for asking me.
Yes, yeah, well, it's been great to have you been brave enough to go first. And I think I want to say to everyone, because this video will be on the WAPSEP YouTube channel and hopefully viewed by people who are interested in the organisation. And so for those who join the association, there is access and online access to previous editions of the journal and your articles there. So members can get into the Taylor and Francis website, download the article and read more.
That's right. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to get the article as one of the free downloads from Taylor and Francis soon. But haven't been able to set that up yet. But it'd be good if we could, to make it something available outside the organisation too.
Yeah, that would be really a fantastic resource. So, well, thank you for that, David, and thank you to everyone who's joined us live online and who will watch this video in the months and years to come. We really appreciate it. Thank you, David.
Thanks very much, John.